On February 23, 2019, Marella Agnelli died at her family home in Turin at the age of 91. She had outlived her husband, the richest man in modern Italian history. She had outlived her only son, who had jumped from a motorway viaduct outside Turin at the age of 46. She had outlived Truman Capote, who had called her his European swan numero uno and then betrayed her confidences in print. She had outlived Babe Paley, Slim Keith, CZ Guest, Gloria Guinness, Pamela Harriman, and Lee Radziwill, every one of the women Capote had called his swans, and she died just days after Radziwill herself, the last two survivors of the original circle, departing within days of each other. She had created 15 homes on both sides of the Atlantic, planted 4 gardens so large they were best described as parks, designed her own line of fabrics, published books of her own photography, worked as a correspondent for Vogue, been inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame, and been photographed by Richard Avedon in an image that now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And through all of it, across 5 decades of marriage to a man whose infidelities were legion, world-famous, and utterly unapologetic, she had maintained a composure so precise that the Times noted she was never so vulgar as to show her feelings in public, though she was wounded by his infidelities. In today's episode of Old Money Allure, we trace the life of Marella Agnelli, the Neapolitan princess who became the most elegant woman of the 20th century, who endured the most spectacular philanderer in European history, who watched her son convert to Islam and fall from a bridge known locally as the Bridge of Suicides, and who outlived every person and every world that had defined her, the last swan standing in a world where all the others had fallen. The phrase, "she was the last swan," her husband slept with everyone, her son jumped off a bridge is a capsule biography, brutal, 3-line, hauntingly accurate, and the life it summarises, from a Neapolitan palazzo to the Avedon studio to the Fossano viaduct, contains within it the full range of what the 20th century did to the women who were born into its highest privileges. It gave them everything except the one thing they needed, which was the right to acknowledge, in public, that the everything they had been given was not enough. Donna Marella Caracciolo di Castagneto was born on May 4, 1927 in Florence, carrying one of the most storied surnames in the Italian peninsula. The stories behind figures like Marella Agnelli, the dynasties they married into, and the private suffering those dynasties concealed, receive extended treatment in our free Substack newsletter, where the personal and institutional wreckage, too complex for documentary format, reveals what these extraordinary lives actually cost the women who lived them. The Agnelli saga belongs in that company. The House of Caracciolo was an ancient Neapolitan clan whose roots stretched to the medieval kingdom of Naples. And her father, Don Filippo Caracciolo, 8th Prince di Castagneto and 3rd Duke di Melito, was far more than an aristocratic ornament. He fought in the Italian resistance, served as executive secretary of the National Liberation Committee, became an under-secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, played a role in bringing the Italian Communist Party into the post-war coalition, rose to become Secretary-General of the Council of Europe, and served as president of the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile from 63 to 65. Her mother, Margaret Clark, was the heiress of a well-known family of whiskey producers from Peoria and Rockford, Illinois, whose American charm and independence proved a lasting counterweight to Neapolitan formality, and Margaret hung her own mother's portraits in rooms furnished with wicker furniture and sprigged cotton. The two strands of Marella's parentage, ancient Roman Catholic aristocracy and practical Midwestern America, generated a sensibility that was simultaneously grand and unpretentious, equally at home in a crumbling palazzo and a kitchen garden, and one Italian account described her childhood as shaped by twin poles. Her grandmother's manners directly imported from Illinois, and the dignified and loquacious Neapolitan aunties in their pearls and black dresses. She grew up with 2 brothers, Don Carlo Caracciolo, who later founded La Repubblica, and the Gruppo Editoriale L'Espresso, earning the epithet Editor Prince, and Don Nicola Caracciolo, an author and documentary filmmaker who became the 10th Prince di Castagneto upon Carlo's death in 2008. Because of their father's diplomatic postings, the children grew up in Florence, Rome and Turkey, absorbing Italian, French and English simultaneously. And the multilingual cosmopolitanism was not an affectation but a condition of daily life in a household where the father's diplomatic career required constant relocation. After secondary schooling in Switzerland, Marella pursued art education in Paris at the Académie des Beaux-Arts and the Académie Julian, studying drawing and theatre design, and the art schools were not a finishing exercise but a genuine professional formation. She moved to New York in 1950, a decision enabled by her family's unusually liberal attitude toward a daughter's independence, and took a position as assistant to Erwin Blumenfeld, one of the most technically innovative fashion photographers of the era, whose surrealist-inflected work appeared regularly in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She trained seriously in his studio, then returned to Italy to work as a correspondent and photographic contributor to Condé Nast's Vogue, and her work would eventually result in published books on Italian gardens with many of her own photographs. She was photographed by virtually every major fashion photographer of the post-war era: Richard Avedon, Irving Penn, Henry Clark, Horst, and Robert Duino, appearing in Vogue in both editorial and credited roles, and in 1963 she was inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame. In 1973 she designed a textile line for the Swiss manufacturer Abraham Zumsteg, the Marella range of printed cotton fabrics inspired by her collaborative work with designer Renzo Mongiardino on Villa Frescote, for which she was awarded the Resources Council's Roscoe in 1977, the equivalent of an Oscar in the design trade. The professional identity Marella built before and during her marriage, the photography, the textile design, the garden books, the Vogue correspondence, was the specific foundation on which her private survival rested, because the woman who endured 5 decades of Gianni Agnelli's Infidelities was not a passive decorative object waiting for her husband to come home, but a working artist whose creative output provided both the psychological refuge and the independent identity that the marriage, with its public grandeur and private betrayals, continuously threatened to destroy. It was in Rome in the early 50s that the future of her life took shape. She had known of Gianni Agnelli since she was a teenager. He appeared regularly in gossip columns as one of Europe's most notorious playboys, and the engagement came in the summer of 1953. Diana Vreeland, then the fashion editor of Harper's Bazaar, had already identified in Marella something beyond beauty, and it was Vreeland who sent Avedon to photograph her, seeing the nobility in her face long before he did. In December of 1953, the same month she married Gianni Agnelli, Richard Avedon photographed Marella in his New York studio. The resulting image shows her in a strapless dress, her back arched, her neck extraordinarily long and graceful, compared by observers to the elongated figures in Modigliani's portraits. Extended into the studio's white negative space, the photograph is gelatin silver, austere in palette, monumental in effect. Avedon selected it as the cover image for the catalogue of his first major retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it now hangs in the Met's permanent collection. Prints have sold at auction at Christie's and Sotheby's, New York, and a 1981 edition, printed in a run of 50, was estimated at 3 to 5 million yen at SBI Art Auction in Tokyo. Truman Capote deployed the word swan with specific philosophical precision. He was not simply naming beautiful women, but identifying those who adhered to some aesthetic system of thought, a code transposed into a self-portrait, and he declared without equivocation that Madame Agnelli is the European swan numero uno. Marella wore the designation with characteristic ambivalence, pleased by the recognition, wary of its reduction, because she was a photographer, a designer, a gardener, a collector, a Vogue contributor, and being a swan, a beautiful object passively observed, was at best a partial account of who she was. The Avedon portrait captured something the word swan could not. the specific quality of a woman whose beauty was inseparable from her intelligence, whose elegance was the external expression of an internal discipline that extended from the arrangement of flowers in a garden to the composition of a photograph, to the management of a marriage that required her to maintain the appearance of serenity, while the man she had married conducted the most public infidelities in European society. Marella married Gianni Agnelli on April 15, 1953, at Osthoffen Castle near Strasbourg, the chapel available because her father was posted there as Secretary-General of the Council of Europe. Gianni was heir to the Fiat Empire and the richest man in modern Italian history, controlling 4.4% of Italy's GDP and 3.1% of its industrial workforce. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev once pulled him aside at a gathering of Italian cabinet ministers and said, "I want to talk to you because you will always be in authority. That lot will never do more than just come and go." Gianni was also, by nearly universal agreement, the most spectacular playboy of the 20th century, styled by the Rake magazine as the definitive Rake of the Riviera, widely described as having the sculptured bearing of an exquisitely tailored Julius Caesar, and his dalliances were legion, world-famous, and utterly unapologetic. Before the marriage, he had conducted a years-long affair with Pamela Harriman, which ended when he crashed his Ferrari into a tree at 120 miles per hour while escaping an angry boyfriend on the French Riviera, leaving him with a permanent limp he wore like a bespoke accessory. His other documented relationships included Anita Ekberg, Rita Hayworth, Jacqueline Kennedy, who was rumoured to have wanted to marry him, Linda Christian, Danielle Darrieux, Silvana Mangano, and Serena Grandi in the mid-80s during the marriage, along with a rumoured encounter with Lee Radziwill, who was also one of Capote's swans. Vanity Fair reported that he romanced Jackie Kennedy, who wanted to marry him, and Pamela Churchill, who also wanted to marry him, and one writer described the social world Gianni inhabited as less immoral than freely amoral. Gianni himself was quoted, "I have known faithful husbands who were terrible husbands, and I have known unfaithful husbands who were great husbands." A self-serving philosophy he lived out with complete consistency for 50 years of marriage to a woman who had married him, knowing the reputation, but who could not have anticipated the specific scale and duration of the infidelities that would follow. The permanent limp from the Ferrari crash became the most characteristic physical detail of Gianni's public persona, worn with the specific insouciance of a man who had been moving at 120 miles per hour on the French Riviera, while escaping the romantic consequences of an affair with Winston Churchill's former daughter-in-law. And the limp itself was a walking advertisement for the kind of life Gianni led. A life in which physical danger and sexual adventure and industrial authority coexisted with the specific ease of someone who had never been required to choose between them. The women he pursued, or who pursued him, constituted a roster that spanned Hollywood, European aristocracy, and American political royalty, and the pursuit was conducted not in secret, but in the pages of the international press, which meant that Marella's humiliation was not private but public, not occasional but continuous, and the specific quality of the marriage she was required to maintain, the public composure, the attendance at galas and state dinners alongside the man whose latest affair was the subject of the gossip column on the same page, was a quality that required a daily expenditure of emotional energy that no observer could fully appreciate. The specific cruelty of Gianni's infidelities was not their frequency, but their visibility. A man conducting affairs in private imposes one kind of humiliation on his wife, but a man whose affairs are conducted in the international press, photographed by paparazzi, discussed in gossip columns, and analysed in Vanity Fair profiles, imposes a qualitatively different kind, because the wife's knowledge is not private, but shared with millions of strangers, and the composure she is required to maintain is something beyond personal discipline. It is a public performance conducted for an audience that is simultaneously sympathising with her suffering and enjoying the spectacle of it. Marella described the Agnelli universe in a Vanity Fair essay as defined by interminable philosophical disquisitions in crumbling Florentine villas, a world where affairs and haute couture coexisted, and the description captured with precision the specific atmosphere of the Agnelli social universe. A universe in which the most powerful man in Italy could conduct affairs with the most famous women in the world, and the social machinery surrounding him would absorb the infidelities as a feature of the system rather than a malfunction. Marella's niece, in the foreword to her 2014 memoir, wrote that in the 60 years since her marriage to Gianni, Marella had created 15 homes located at varying altitudes on both sides of the Atlantic and north and south of the Mediterranean, planted 4 gardens so large and articulate they are best described as parks, and designed her own line of fabrics. The estates in Turin, Rome, Milan, New York, St. Moritz and Marrakech were not simply homes but curated spaces, and she worked with Renzo Mongiardino and architect Guy Aulenti to build environments of timeless elegance, invaluable art and groundbreaking decorating ideas. The homes were the specific medium through which Marella expressed the creative intelligence that the swan designation failed to capture. Each property was a collaboration between her aesthetic vision and the architects and designers she selected, and the gardens which she designed and planted and documented through her own photography were the most personal expression of a woman whose public life was defined by the Agnelli name, but whose private life was defined by the specific, patient, absorbing labour of making things grow. The 12-home empire was also, in a way that Marella acknowledged with characteristic indirection, the structure she had built to survive the marriage, because each property was a world she controlled entirely, a space where the decisions about colour and fabric and planting and light were hers alone. And the specific discipline of creating beauty in physical spaces was the counterweight to the specific chaos of being married to a man whose emotional life was conducted across the bedrooms of 3 continents. She was, in short, an artist who made her life her art form, and the distinction between the art and the life, between the garden she planted and the marriage she endured, was the distinction that made her story simultaneously magnificent and tragic, because the same woman who created spaces of extraordinary beauty was living inside a marriage that required her to treat her husband's public infidelities with the same composed elegance she applied to the arrangement of furniture in a drawing room. The Villa Fresco collaboration with Mongiardino, which produced the Marella range of textiles, was the specific project that demonstrated most completely the integration of Marella's creative and domestic lives, because the fabrics she designed were inspired by the interiors she had created, which were themselves inspired by the gardens she had planted, which were documented through the photographs she had taken, and the entire cycle of creation from garden to photograph to textile to interior was the expression of a single aesthetic intelligence operating across multiple media with a consistency that the design world recognized with the Roscoe Award, and that the broader world, fixated on the Agnelli name and the swan designation, largely failed to appreciate. The distinction between Marella the Swan and Marella the Artist is the distinction that defines her biography. The swan designation reduced her to her beauty and her marriage, while the artistic practice that she sustained for 6 decades, through infidelities and inheritance disputes and the death of her son, was the specific achievement that outlasted the beauty, outlasted the marriage, and outlasted the social world in which the swan designation had been coined. In the 50s and 60s, Capote assembled around himself the circle he called his swans: Babe Paley, Slim Keith, CZ Guest, Lee Radziwill, Gloria Guinness, Pamela Harriman, and Marella Agnelli. Capote collected his swans, Lawrence Lima writes, as if collecting exquisite paintings that he wanted to hang in his home for the rest of his life, sailing on their yachts, flying on their planes, staying at their estates, and in return banishing dullness from the table as a sparkling, peerless raconteur. Marella described the friendship in a 2014 Vanity Fair excerpt. "I considered Truman one of my dearest friends, perhaps even the closest. His warmth and wit allowed him to forge deep connections quickly. I found myself divulging things to him that I never thought I would share with anyone. He had the ability to foster a profound sense of closeness, yet he was waiting, like a hawk. The reckoning came in November of 75, when Esquire published the excerpt from Answered Prayers titled La Côte Basque, 1965, which critic James Wolcott called an abattoir of hatefulness, a thinly veiled fictionalization of the swans' most intimate secrets, their affairs, their marriages, their private humiliations. Capote had told people his book would do to America what Proust did to France. Instead, it destroyed his social world overnight. Marella had discovered Capote's nature earlier, during a Mediterranean cruise on her yacht, when he showed her chapters, and she told him, "Oh, Truman, this resembles a gossip column. What are you getting yourself into?" She had also noticed his habit of trying to separate the swans from each other. He would tell you about their little défauts, their faiblesses, trying to woo you away from them in a funny way. It was as if Truman would only be happy if they left their husbands, and he was indisputably the most important man in their lives. After a visit to Turin, Marella vowed to end the friendship, and Truman was so self-absorbed that it took him a long while to realize she had taken him out of her life. She was one of the few swans who exited on her own terms before the full catastrophe, and her absence from the 2024 FX drama feud, Capote versus the Swans, was precisely because her story ended with deliberate, quiet dignity rather than scandalous rupture. Edoardo Agnelli was born in New York City on June 9, 1954, the only son of Gianni and Marella, and should by birthright have inherited one of the most powerful industrial empires in the world. Fiat, Ferrari, Juventus Football Club, major newspapers and banks. Friends called him Crazy Eddie in his New York years for his restless, wild adolescence. He attended the Liceo Classico in Turin, then Atlantic College in Wales, before reading modern literature and Eastern philosophy at Princeton, and after Princeton he travelled to Kenya, Iran and India, where he met the spiritual teacher Sathya Sai Baba and pursued an increasingly intense interest in Eastern mysticism. The central drama of his adult life was his conversion to Islam. While browsing a New York library in his mid-20s, he picked up a copy of the Quran in English and later described the experience. "I started reading it, and I felt that those words were holy words and cannot be the words of men. I was really touched and borrowed the book, and studied it further, and I felt like I was understanding it and I believed it." He converted first to Sunni Islam at an Islamic center in New York, taking the name Hisham Aziz, then travelled to Iran, met Ayatollah Khamenei, and converted to Shia Islam, taking the additional name Mahdi. La Repubblica reported that his preoccupations became increasingly erratic: mysticism, Franciscanism, Buddhism, lectures against capital, praise of the poor, criticism of the behaviour of fiat, and according to The Guardian, his anti-materialist views drove him in a completely different direction from his parents. The collision between Edoardo's spiritual life and his father's industrial empire was total. Gianni was unhappy with the conversion and ensured Edoardo would not inherit fiat, the only official position Edoardo held being a directorship of Juventus, which placed him at the Heysel Stadium disaster in 85. In 90, Edoardo was accused of heroin possession in Kenya. The charges dropped, and he then dramatically announced at a press conference that he was taking over Fiat, a stunt that earned his father's final fury and led Gianni to pass over Edoardo entirely in favour of his nephew Giovanni Alberto Agnelli, who himself died of stomach cancer at 33 in 97, precipitating a dynastic crisis at Fiat that confirmed what Edoardo's disinheritance had already demonstrated, that the Agnelli Empire, for all its industrial authority and financial resources, was unable to produce a stable succession, and that the dynasty that controlled 4.4% of Italian GDP could not control the specific biological and psychological forces that determined whether its heirs would survive long enough and sanely enough to inherit. The trajectory of Edoardo's life, from the privileged son of Italy's richest family to a Shia convert mourned by Iranian state media, is one of the most extraordinary biographical arcs of the 20th century, and the specific quality that makes it relevant to Marella's story is that she witnessed every stage of the arc, from the restless adolescence in New York to the Princeton years, to the spiritual searching in India and Iran, to the heroin accusation in Kenya, to the press conference announcing the Fiat takeover, to the final morning when Eduardo ordered lunch from his chef and drove to a bridge outside Turin and did not come back. The mother who had maintained her composure through 5 decades of Gianni's infidelities was required to maintain it through something far worse: the progressive loss of a son who was moving further from her world with every conversion and every spiritual journey, until the distance between them, measured in theology and geography, and the specific incomprehension of a Neapolitan aristocrat confronting her son's embrace of Shia Islam had become so great that no bridge could cross it except, in the most terrible irony of the entire story, the one he fell from. On November 15, 2000, Edoardo Agnelli was found dead on the riverbed beneath the Fossano motorway viaduct outside Turin, a stretch of bridge known locally as the Bridge of Suicides. He was 46 years old. His Fiat Croma was found parked on the bridge, engine running, with his identification papers inside. His body bore injuries consistent with a fall of approximately 80 metres. Gianni himself came to identify his son's body and was reported not to have cried, but was described as devastated. The public prosecutor closed the investigation and ruled the death a taking of his own life. But the ruling raised persistent questions. Journalist Giuseppe Pupo published a book in 2009 identifying several oddities, including that Eduardo's personal bodyguards were inexplicably absent, that a 2-hour interval between when he left home and arrived at the viaduct remains unexplained, that security camera footage from the car was never released, that no fingerprints were found on the vehicle, that there were no witnesses along a road section that recorded at least 8 cars per minute at that time of day, and that his chef stated Eduardo had ordered lunch for later that morning before leaving. Iranian state media and certain Shia sources have framed the death as politically motivated, arguing his conversion made him a liability to the Agnelli family's relationships with Western financial and political networks. The Italian prosecutor's conclusion has never been officially revisited. He was buried next to his cousin Giovanni Alberto in the family vault at Villar Perosa, and he is still mourned by Shia Muslim communities around the world as Mahdi Agnelli, a figure they regard as a martyr of faith. For Marella, who had watched her son travel from Princeton to mysticism to a motorway bridge, who had seen him disinherited by the father whose empire he had been born to inherit, and who had lived with the specific pain of a mother whose child has chosen a path so radically different from the world she inhabits that she can neither follow him nor understand where he has gone. The death of Eduardo was the wound from which no amount of garden design or architectural restoration could provide recovery. The bridge outside Turin, known locally by its grim designation, had claimed other lives before Eduardo's and would claim others afterward, and the specific horror of the location for Marella was that it was close to home, not in some distant country where Eduardo's spiritual journeys had taken him, but on a road outside the city where the Agnelli family had built its empire within the geography of daily life, which meant that every drive through the Turin suburbs carried the possibility of passing the specific stretch of motorway from which her son had fallen, a geography of grief inscribed onto the ordinary movements of a life that continued, as lives do, in the same city where the worst thing that had ever happened to her had occurred. Gianni Agnelli died of prostate cancer in January of 2003, and in the years that followed, Marella was embroiled in a bitter inheritance dispute with her surviving daughter Margherita, who sued the family's advisers, demanding to know the true extent of Gianni's fortune. Marella, in a public letter, accused Margherita of betraying the will of Gianni Agnelli and alleged that she had spread numerous falsehoods, which add bitterness to an affair that is sad and painful for me. The inheritance dispute, conducted in public between a mother and a daughter over the fortune of a dead patriarch, was the final degradation of the Agnelli family's public image, because the same dynasty that had controlled 4.4% of Italian GDP and been courted by Soviet leaders and American presidents was now fighting in the courts over the specific allocation of assets that the patriarch had accumulated across a lifetime of industrial authority and personal excess. Marella endured the dispute with the same measured composure that had defined her entire life. She purchased and restored a dilapidated villa in Marrakesh, published books about her gardens, became honorary president of the Giovanni and Marella Agnelli Pinacoteca in Turin, and continued to maintain the specific creative practice, the photography, the garden design, the architectural restoration that had sustained her through 5 decades of marriage and through the death of her son. The composure was not coldness but discipline, the specific response of a woman who had been raised in the household of a resistance fighter and a Midwestern heiress, and who had learned from both parents that the expression of pain in public was a form of weakness that the people watching would use against you, and that the only defence against a world that took pleasure in the suffering of the prominent was the refusal to provide that pleasure by maintaining, at whatever cost, the appearance of serenity. The Marrakesh villa, purchased and restored in the years after Gianni's death, was the final creative act of Marella's life, and the most revealing. A woman in her late 70s, who had lost her son and her husband, and was fighting her daughter over the estate, chose to respond, not by retreating into grief, but by buying a dilapidated property in North Africa and restoring it to beauty, a decision that was simultaneously an act of creative defiance and a continuation of the specific practice that had sustained her since the earliest years of her marriage. The garden books she published, featuring her own photographs, were the permanent record of the creative intelligence that the swan designation had obscured, and the photographs themselves, of Italian gardens shot with the technical skill she had learned in Blumenfeld's studio in New York in 1950, were evidence that the woman the world called a swan had been from the beginning a working artist whose medium was not her own beauty, but the beauty she created around her. The inheritance dispute with Margherita was the specific event that most completely exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Agnelli dynasty. The family that had projected an image of industrial authority and personal elegance to the world for a century was now fighting over money in the courts, and the woman who had spent 60 years maintaining the family's public image was now publicly accusing her own daughter of betrayal. The dispute confirmed what Edoardo's death and Gianni's infidelities had already suggested, that the Agnelli family, for all its wealth and authority, and the specific beauty of the homes Marella had created across 2 continents, was a family whose private reality bore no resemblance to the portrait that had been presented to the world, and that the portrait, maintained for 6 decades by the woman Avedon had photographed in 1953, had been the most sustained and the most accomplished work of art Marella ever produced. In 2014, Rizzoli published Marella Agnelli, The Last Swan, an autobiographical memoir co-authored with her niece, organised around her homes, using the estates in Turin, Rome, Milan, New York, St. Moritz and Marrakesh, as a lens through which to explore 60 years of Agnelli life. The title was not self-aggrandizing but elegiac. By then she was the last of her kind, the final survivor of a social world that no longer existed. The Vanity Fair excerpt she wrote describing her friendship with Capote, how he made her feel uniquely known, and how he betrayed that knowledge, remains one of the most dignified accounts any swan produced, neither scorning him entirely nor forgiving him fully, the kind of nuanced emotional reckoning that only someone of great intelligence and long suffering achieves. The swan's stories were as dramatic as Marella's own. Babe Paley endured the serial infidelities of CBS chairman William Paley and died of lung cancer in 1978. Anne Woodward shot and killed her husband in 55, claiming she mistook him for a burglar, and died by her own hand in October of 75, just before Capote's story about her was published, her younger son, Jimmy, jumping to his death from a hotel a year later, and her older son, William, taking his own life in 99. Slim Keith died of lung cancer in 90. Pamela Harriman died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 97, and Lee Radziwill died in February of 2019, days before Marella herself. Capote died in August of 84 at 59. His reported last words, "beautiful babe," and the social ostracism following answered prayers had destroyed his final years. The world the swans had inhabited, the yachts and the private jets and the lunches at La Côte Basque, and the Balmain fittings, and the black and white ball at the plaza, was a world that required specific conditions to exist. The concentrated wealth of the post-war decades, the specific class formation that produced women whose beauty and education and social position placed them at the centre of a transatlantic social circuit, and the shared assumption that the cultivation of personal elegance was itself a form of achievement rather than a commercial exercise. By 2019, those conditions had dissolved, and the last woman who had embodied them was gone. The specific quality that connected the swans' stories to each other and to the broader history of women and influence in the 20th century was the quality of survival conducted in public. Each of these women had suffered betrayals, whether by husbands or by Capote, or by the specific cruelty of a social world that demanded perfection while providing none, and each had responded by maintaining the composed exterior that the world expected while absorbing the damage in private, and the cost of that absorption measured in lung cancer and cerebral hemorrhages and barbiturate overdoses, and the quiet deaths of women whose public images had been maintained at the expense of their private health, was the cost that the swan ecology imposed on its inhabitants. Marella, who outlived all of them, paid the cost for the longest period and in the largest denominations, because her marriage lasted 50 years, and her husband's infidelities lasted 50 years, and her son's spiritual crisis lasted 20 years, and the inheritance dispute lasted a decade. And through all of it, from the Avedon portrait in 53 to the Marrakesh villa in the 2000s, she maintained the specific composure that the world had come to expect from the European swan numero uno. Capote's swans were, in the estimation of the writers who studied them, the last of a kind, women of what used to be called class and breeding, who made as gracious a show of privilege as they could in a rapidly evolving modern society. Many of them paid extraordinary prices for the positions they occupied. Babe Paley endured Bill Paley's infidelities while maintaining one of the most admired public images in American society. Slim Keith had her husband stolen by Pamela Churchill and was then betrayed by Capote in print. CZ Guest maintained her position through decades of Philadelphia and New York social life. And Marella outlived them all, watching from Turin as the circle contracted, one death at a time until she was the only one left. The specific quality that connected the swans was not beauty alone, which fades, or wealth alone, which can be lost, but the specific combination of both sustained across decades by a discipline of self-presentation so rigorous that it became, for the women who practiced it, indistinguishable from identity itself. Marella, who had been a photographer and a designer before she became a swan, understood this better than any of them. She knew that the self she presented to the world, the composed, elegant, unflinching Madame Agnelli of the Avedon portrait, was simultaneously her greatest achievement and her most confining creation, because the woman inside the portrait was also a woman whose son had fallen from a bridge and whose husband had slept with Anita Ekberg and Jackie Kennedy and Pamela Churchill, and the portrait did not show any of that, and was not designed to. The specific labour of maintaining the distance between what the portrait showed and what the woman behind it had endured was the labour that defined Marella's life from the day of her marriage to the day of her death. And the Avedon photograph, which now hangs in the Met and has sold at auction for significant sums, is the most precise visual record of that labour. It shows a woman of extraordinary beauty and composure in a moment when the composure was still effortless, because the marriage was new and the infidelities had not yet accumulated, and the son had not yet been born, and the bridge outside Turin had not yet entered the story. The distance between the woman in the photograph and the woman who died in Turin 66 years later is the distance that Marella travelled across a lifetime of private suffering and public grace. And the photograph's specific power is that it preserves the moment before any of it happened, the last instant when the composure was natural rather than achieved, when the beauty was unshadowed and the future was still a promise rather than a burden. Marella Agnelli died on February 23, 2019, at her home in Turin. Piedmont Governor Sergio Ciamparino said Italy had lost an illustrious figure who accompanied Turin's 20th century history with grace and elegance. Juventus Football Club published a tribute. The art community mourned a great patron. And fashion mourned the last woman for whom style was not a commercial category, but a philosophical stance. Her life refutes any simple reading. She was not a beautiful woman who suffered in silence, but a formidably intelligent, genuinely creative person, a Vogue contributor, an architect of beautiful spaces, a patron of design, a photographer, a gardener, a woman who happened to inhabit a world in which all of that talent was systematically subordinated to her role as Gianni Agnelli's wife. She endured his infidelities across 5 decades without public complaint, maintaining her dignity with a precision that seemed to impress and unsettle in equal measure. She watched her only son spiral from Princeton to mysticism to a motorway bridge outside Turin. She outlived him, outlived her husband, outlived her marriage, outlived Capote, outlived her fellow swans, all of them, and still found the strength to restore a villa in Marrakesh and write a memoir. The phrase "the last swan" was not about chronology but about the extinction of a type. The cultivated, disciplined, privately suffering, publicly immaculate woman that the modern world no longer produces, and the specific grace with which Marella carried the weight of everything that had been done to her. The philandering husband, the disinherited son, the betraying friend, the inheritance dispute with her own daughter, was the grace that earned her the designation and that outlasted every person and every institution that had contributed to the weight. She was the last swan. Her husband slept with everyone. Her son jumped off a bridge. And she endured it all with a composure that was not the absence of feeling, but its most disciplined expression, the specific achievement of a woman who had decided, at some point in the 60 years of her marriage, that the world would not see her break, and who kept that promise to herself for the rest of her life. The 15 homes were the physical evidence of that promise, each one a space of beauty created by a woman who refused to allow the ugliness of her private circumstances to determine the quality of the environments she inhabited, and the gardens she planted and tended across 2 continents were the most personal expression of the specific philosophy that sustained her. The philosophy that beauty could be created even in circumstances of profound suffering, and that the creation of beauty was not an evasion of suffering, but a response to it. The specific response of an artist who had been trained in Blumenfeld's studio and who understood that the composition of a photograph, like the composition of a life, required the specific discipline of choosing what to include and what to exclude, and that the choice to exclude the pain from the frame was not denial, but art.